But if I want to calculate the actual total revenue, well, the first challenge I have is that may not be in the order table itself. Each order has a series of line items or details that go with it. So how do I connect this to the order details? And living up to what Kevin said earlier, how do we do this without having to drop down to the level of writing any computer syntax, which in this case it means not writing any SQL. And I want to be clear, to use this tool, someone has to understand your data. They need to understand what tables, what fields, what metrics you care about, but they shouldn't have to write SQL. And here's how we do that. From the orders, I say I want to insert a relation to some other piece of information. And I can choose from any of the other tables available to me, and here's my line items or order details, and I'll choose that. Once I have access to the line items, what I would do here is to say, from the Table Fields tab, I get access to all the fields in each of these tables. So from the order detail, I'm going to say that the order ID of the line item, the order detail, has to equal the order ID that I see in the original order. And once I've done that, I'll now have access to all of the line items that go with my order, so I can continue to drag out the fields I want. If I want to calculate the value of an order, well, I'll need things such as the unit price that went with that and the quantity that went with that. So that's the beginnings of this. But the next challenge I run into is, well, yeah, but I've got an employee ID here, and the rest of the information on the employee is actually in my human resources system. So how do I now join between multiple tables in two different databases? This is an area that would be reasonably complex and slow in most environments. Here's what we would do. From my order, I say that I want to insert a relation, but not insert a generic relation. I want to insert a relation to some external data source. And here I've got access to all the connections I've defined, such as my HR system. And once I selected that, I now have access to all the tables, such as the employees table within that system. And from here on in, it looks identical to as if I was doing this from within just a single database. I go to the table fields and say that from my HR system, the employee ID of the employee table has to equal the employee ID that I see from the original order in my order management system. And now I have access to all the employee information that goes with this order. So that, for instance, if I'm interested in being able to look at these orders broken down by employee name, I'll choose the name field. Now, in the employee table, it makes sense to call it last name. Maybe in my event that I'm building, I want to call this employee. And I should point out, it's often not as simple as just dragging a field across. You might need to concatenate fields, or you may need to pull a substring of one field and add it to something else to generate a key that you need to join across systems. But all of that is just as easy to do as everything else you'll say using this create derived field option. It will give me a graphical interface to manipulate the various data values if I needed to cut and paste pieces and put them together. So now I've built up the business event with everything that I wanted in that, and I did this all without having to write any SQL. But of course, before you implement this in production, there's going to be a DBA that's going to want to understand what's really going on. So if I click on the Queries tab, I can now see the auto-generated SQL that's going to run against the order management system as well as the HR system to pull back the data I need. And if your database administrator looked at this and said, yeah, but I've got a better way of doing that, or I want to call a stored procedure to get this information, you can always click where it says Use Custom Query, and now you can customize this to your heart's content. You can make any changes you wanted. But the point is, you don't need to write any SQL, and it will do it for you. Now, another important point about what we're doing here, and another contrast to the traditional approach, is that we're just doing incremental data updates. We're never going to go out to the source data system and say, give me a snapshot of all your information, and then a week later say, all right, give me a snapshot again. What we do instead is, based on this event time, we're able to give you a trigger. Now, here's the default trigger which says, only give me the data that after the last time I checked and before the current date. So that's why the query gets this where clause. And what it means is that we're only going to be getting new transactions since last time we checked. So we can go out periodically and query the database or the source data for new transactions. And if we query the source data every day, then we're saying, give me the new transactions for the previous day. Whereas if we do it every 10 minutes, we'll only get 10 minutes worth of transactions. And all of that is controllable by these settings where I can say, how often do I want to go out to the source data to query for new information? Or I can even put in a specific time and say, at this time during the day, I want to go out and get my new transactions. Or there could be multiple times when you go out and get new transactions. So the point being, We're only going to get incremental transactions. We're going to get them when you tell the system to get it, and only as often as you actually need them. Once I define the business event, I can always come up here and say, for some period of time, I want to run a test on this. So I let it run for a while, stop it when I've got some data to look at, and from here I can see the data that's being brought back and populating my event. In this case, my order event, I see country and city and price and quantity. And I also see an employee name, not an ID, so that I know that at this point I've dynamically joined the data from the order management system and the human resources system to generate this one event with everything I need in it. Once I've built my business event, in this case coming from 3 different tables across 2 databases, what do I do next? I go back to the guide. The guide tells me the next step is something called event mapping. Now I found this a little confusing at first. I just mapped from these multiple tables into my event. Why am I at another step called event mapping? And the reason is very important. The reason is that we have 2 levels of events. There's something called a real event, such as this order I just defined, that maps back to some actual data sources. But we also have a second level of event called an archetype event. Think of this as a standard or canonical format of event. And the reason for 2-level event structure is that most of our larger customers don't just have one order management system. They may have acquired other companies or for other reasons have multiple systems with similar data, in which case I have an order pointing back to a particular order management system. I might have order 2 that points back to some other system and maybe additional ones. What this allows me to do is I can map order to my archetypical order, but then I can also map order 2 to my standard order and order 3 to my standard order. In other words, it gives me an easy way to graphically define an aggregation of data across multiple systems, essentially unioning the data across multiple systems. And one challenge we run into is I may have multiple orders in different systems, but they use subtly different encodings in various places or other changes. I can allow for that. I can normalize for those differences in a derived field in each individual real order such that I can then map all of them over to my archetype order with a standard meaning. Another important reason for this 2-level event structure is I started with the database, and from the database I built out my real event called order. From that I built my archetype event called order. And from this I'm going to build metrics and I'm going to build dashboards. But in reality, you don't need to start with the data. All of the metric definition, the KPI definition, the dashboards are all built off of this archetype event. So what that means, particularly to a systems integrator, is that they can embed their domain expertise into a definition of the standard event forms and what fields they should have and what metrics you want from that. All of that can be defined at this level even before you've got access to the actual data, so that an organization can build their organizational expertise into a series of events and metrics before they visit a customer site, and then when they get on site, map it to the actual customer data. So those are a couple of main reasons for this 2-level event mapping structure. Once I've got my archetype event created, I go back to my guide, and the next step I see here is to define what are the metrics, the key performance indicators that I want to calculate. Now to be clear, we have one event here called an order, but each event can lead to multiple metrics. So from an order, we might want to know number of orders per employee, or average order size per city. Or in this case, we might want to look at the total revenue coming from an order. All of these are KPIs that would be derived from the same type of order event. So to define this, I simply say I want to create a new KPI. In this case, I wanted to define one called revenue. Now, a KPI, a metric, is calculated from some event. Well, we've only created one event so far, so we use that one called an order. If I define a business process, then I could include a process KPI, such as how long did it take to go from this step to conclusion when we didn't have an exception? How long did it take when we did have an exception? What percentage of the time did we have an exception? All of those would be examples of process KPIs that we might want. I can also say that this revenue KPI is a format currency. Now, a nice thing about this is because we're not using a separate ETL, data warehouse, and BI tool, we're using one tool to do all these functions. It means that I put this kind of metadata in one place and it's used everywhere as appropriate. So now that I said I want a revenue KPI based on orders, the actual definition of the guts of the calculation is done in the KPI definition window. The SQL area is one place where we avoid syntax that a lot of tools would write you to drop down to. This is another place where most tools, to define some kind of mathematical formula, will probably have to use some kind of a scripting language.